The Anderson family's dream was built of red brick and white trim, nestled at the end of a cul-de-sac on Willow Creek Drive. For Mark and Sarah, it represented a pinnacle of their hard work. For their 7-year-old daughter, Chloe, it was a kingdom of lush lawns and quiet streets, perfect for riding her bright pink bicycle. The neighborhood, Willow Creek Estates, was a masterpiece of suburban conformity, a place where every blade of grass knew its place. This order was maintained, with an iron will and a pearl clutcher's disdain, by the Willow Creek Homeowners Association and its undisputed queen, Eleanor Vance. Eleanor was a woman who wore tastefulness like a suit of armor. Her silver blonde hair was never out of place, her gardening gloves were spotless, and her gaze could detect a wilting petunia from 50 yards. She presided over the architectural committee and the board with the absolute certainty of someone who believed property values were directly linked to the suffering of her neighbors. The Andersons learned the rules quickly. A notice arrived because their trash cans were visible from the street on a non-collection day. Another cited them for the unapproved cultivar of tulips Sarah had planted. Mark received a sternly worded email about the excessive wear on his driveway from his vintage forest green Mustang, a project car that was his pride and joy. They complied, they paid the fines, they bit their tongues. It was the price of paradise. Then, the world shifted. Chloe began stumbling, her legs losing their strength. After a terrifying battery of tests, the diagnosis came: a progressive neuromuscular disorder. The vibrant little girl who raced her bicycle was now confined to a sleek, silver wheelchair. The beautiful dream house with its 3 porch steps had become an insurmountable cliff face. "We need a ramp," Sarah said one evening, her voice hollow with exhaustion. They were sitting at their kitchen table, the silence of the house pressing in on them. Mark, a project manager for a construction firm and a skilled carpenter by trade, immediately began sketching. He didn't want a clinical, aluminum eyesore. He designed a graceful, sweeping ramp of cedar, with a gentle slope and custom railings, stained to match their porch. It was, he thought, beautiful. They submitted the plans to the HOA, their hearts heavy with a hope they dared not feel. The response came a week later, on the HOA's heavy, cream-colored stationery. Sarah's hand trembled as she read it aloud. To the residents of 1421 Willow Creek Drive, the Architectural Committee has reviewed your proposal for a wheelchair ramp. While the committee is sympathetic to your situation, the proposed structure is a significant deviation from the property's original design and does not conform to the community's aesthetic standards as outlined in Covenant 7b. Subsection 4. No exterior alterations shall detract from the uniform and harmonious appearance of the properties. Your request is hereby denied. You may explore alternative solutions, such as a rear entry modification or a less obtrusive, portable ramp system. Sincerely, Eleanor Vance, Chairwoman Alternative Solutions. Mark exploded, snatching the letter. A rear entry modification would cost $30,000 we don't have. A portable ramp, for a permanent condition? This is monstrous. They decided to appeal at the next HOA meeting. The community hall was packed with the usual suspects: the anxious, the compliant, the bored. Eleanor Vance sat at the head table, a gavel beside her water glass, looking like a benevolent despot. When their turn came, Mark stood, holding a large photograph of Chloe, smiling from her wheelchair. "This is our daughter, Chloe," he began, his voice thick. "This ramp isn't a luxury or a design preference. It's her access to her own home. Without it, we have to carry her, and soon, we won't be able to. Denying this is denying her her independence, her dignity." He spoke of the cedar, the stain, the care he had taken to make it harmonious. Sarah followed, her voice quieter but sharper. "You speak of property values. What is the value of a property that has no place for a little girl in a wheelchair? What does that say about us as a community?" For a moment, the room was silent. A few people looked down at their hands, ashamed. Then Eleanor Vance leaned into the microphone, her voice dripping with condescending reason. "Mr. and Mrs. Anderson, no one here questions your love for your child. But we are a community of rules. Rules that protect everyone's investment. If we make an exception for you, we must make an exception for everyone. Soon, we have vinyl siding, chain link fences, and, heaven forbid, pink houses. We must consider the collective good." The answer remains no. The collective good. The phrase tasted like ash. They left the meeting, defeated and invisible. That night, watching Chloe struggle as he carried her up the steps, her small body tense in his arms, Mark made a decision. "To hell with them," he whispered to Sarah. "We're building it." He worked through the weekend. The sound of his hammer and saw was a rebellion. Neighbors peeked through blinds. Some shook their heads, others offered silent, furtive thumbs up. When it was done, it was beautiful. Functional, yes, but also a work of craft and love. For 3 days, it was glorious. Chloe learned to navigate the smooth curve, giggling as she gained speed, a wide, uninhibited smile on her face that her parents hadn't seen in months. It was a small victory, but it felt like a revolution. On the 4th morning, they were jolted awake by the grinding roar of a diesel engine. Mark looked out the window to see a city tow truck, its yellow lights flashing, hooking up his vintage Mustang, which was parked in his own driveway. "No," he yelled, sprinting outside in his boxers and a t-shirt. "That's my car, on my property." The tow truck driver, a burly man with a bored expression, handed him a ticket. "Violation of HOA bylaw 9C, sir. Vehicles must not obstruct the approved visual plane of the property. Complaint from the HOA. You can pick it up at the impound lot on Industrial Drive. Cash or credit only." As the driver got back into his cab, Mark's eyes fell on the car. The sharp, metal lip of the tow truck's liftgate had scraped along the entire driver's side, leaving a long, deep, silver gash in the forest green paint, a vicious scar on his cherished possession. Rage, cold and pure, flooded his system. This was no longer about a ramp, it was a declaration of war. Just then, a police cruiser, silent but with lights flashing, turned onto their street. Mark's heart plummeted. "She's called the cops on us for violating the ban." Eleanor Vance stood on her immaculate lawn across the street, arms crossed, a look of supreme vindication on her face. But the two officers walked right past a stunned Mark. They approached Eleanor. "Eleanor Vance," the older officer said, his voice devoid of emotion. "We're responding to a 911 call. We need to ask you a few questions regarding the deliberate obstruction of the federally mandated reasonable accommodation for a person with a disability, and the alleged instigation of vandalism to a vehicle." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Mark looked from the police to Eleanor, whose smug mask had slipped into confusion, then to his own house. Their next-door neighbor, Mr. Gable, a quiet, retired man who mostly tended his rose bushes, stood on his porch. He gave Mark a small, grim nod. He had seen the tow truck arrive. He had seen the damage being done. And he, a retired civil rights attorney, had decided his time for silence was over. This was the first, shocking twist. The police were there for Eleanor. But Eleanor, ever the legalistic predator, quickly recovered. "Officers, this is a misunderstanding. This is a civil matter between a homeowner and their association. The HOA is well within its rights to enforce its legally binding covenants. The damage to the vehicle is a matter for the towing company's insurance." She presented them with a folder. "Here are the relevant covenants and the denial letter." She was technically correct. The police, after taking statements from everyone, could only file a report. They couldn't make an arrest. Eleanor had hidden behind her paperwork fortress. As the cruiser drove away, she shot the Andersons a look of pure, unadulterated triumph. She had won. Dejection threatened to swallow them whole. But that evening, there was a soft knock on their door. It was Mr. Gable, holding a bottle of bourbon and a leather-bound notebook. "I believe it's time we had a strategy session," he said, his eyes sharp behind his spectacles. In their living room, with Chloe sleeping peacefully upstairs, Mr. Gable laid out the battlefield. "Eleanor is correct that HOA governance is a civil matter, but she is profoundly, spectacularly wrong about the larger law. She has violated the Fair Housing Act of 1968, as amended, and the Americans with Disabilities Act. Denying a reasonable accommodation like a wheelchair ramp for a person with a verified disability is illegal discrimination. It is a federal offense." He opened his notebook. "We are not going to fight her on her petty bylaws. We are going to nuke her from orbit with federal law. We will sue her, personally, and the entire HOA board for discrimination, emotional distress, and damages." A fire was lit. This was no longer a desperate rebellion, it was a calculated campaign. They became a team. Mark documented everything: the ramp, the damaged Mustang with close-up photos, the tow truck receipt, the whole letters. Sarah kept a journal of Chloe's emotional state, recording her joy with the ramp and her fear after the tow truck incident. They got a forceful letter from Chloe's neurologist, Mr. Gable, with the relish of a lawyer back in his element, drafted a pre-litigation demand letter. It was a masterpiece. It demanded the immediate, permanent approval of the ramp, the immediate resignation of Eleanor Vance from the HOA board, full financial restitution for the repair of the Mustang, plus the impound fees, payment of their impending legal fees, a formal, written apology to the Anderson family, to be read aloud at the next HOA meeting. And then Mr. Gable unveiled his secret weapon. "While I was reviewing the HOA's publicly available financial disclosures," he said, a sly smile on his face, "I noticed some curious anomalies in the Capital Improvement and Beautification Fund. Large sums were transferred for landscaping consultancy to a company that, upon cross-referencing with the State Business Registry, is owned by Eleanor Vance's brother-in-law. This same company invoiced for the community fountain that was installed last year, a fountain that, curiously, is located in Eleanor's backyard. It was embezzlement. She wasn't just a tyrant, she was a crook. They didn't just send the demand letter to the HOA board. Mr. Gable helped them mail a copy, along with a simpler, damning summary, to every single homeowner in Willow Creek Estates. The next HOA meeting was not just packed, it was a mob. The air crackled with anger not just at the Andersons' treatment, but at the potential theft of their own money. Eleanor tried to gavel the meeting to order, but her authority had evaporated. Mark, Sarah, and Mr. Gable walked to the front of the room without being called. "Your gavel isn't needed tonight, Eleanor," Mr. Gable said, his voice carrying easily through the hall. "We're here to present the facts." For the next 30 minutes, they systematically dismantled her reign. Sarah spoke, her voice trembling not with fear, but with a mother's righteous fury, describing the humiliation of having to break the rules so her daughter could enter her own home. Mark held up the photos of the scarred Mustang. "This is the true face of your aesthetics, petty, vindictive, and criminal." Then Mr. Gable took over. He calmly explained the FOA and the HOA. He outlined the lawsuit they were prepared to file. A lawsuit that would not only bankrupt the HOA's insurance but could lead to personal liability for every board member who voted to uphold the denial. The room was dead silent. Then he dropped the final bomb. "And while we are on the topic of rules and fiduciary duty," he said, placing a spreadsheet on the projector, "perhaps someone can explain why $15.00 from your beautification fund was paid to Vance Landscaping and Consultancy for a fountain that now resides in the backyard of the board president." The room erupted. The silent majority found its voice. "You thief! We paid for your fountain. I knew the dues were too high." Eleanor Vance looked like a ghost. The police were a nuisance. The federal lawsuit was a threat. But this public exposure of her corruption, her greed, in front of the very people whose respect she craved, was a mortal blow. Her carefully constructed facade of respectability shattered into a million pieces. A vote for her immediate removal was called. The ayes were a thunderous roar. The board, desperate to save themselves from the lawsuit, immediately motioned to grant the Andersons every single one of their demands. 1 month later, the ramp on Willow Creek Drive was not just a structure, it was a monument. At its base, a small, polished brass plaque gleamed in the sun. "Chloe's Path, Courage over Conformity." The Mustang was in a specialty shop, its repair bill paid in full by the HOA, a check that had arrived with a formal letter of apology. Eleanor Vance's house was on the market. A new interim board was formed, with Mr. Gable acting as a special advisor. The first new rule they passed was dubbed Chloe's Law, a bylaw stating that reasonable accommodations for disability, age, or necessity would always take precedence over aesthetic covenants, and that any denial would require a full, transparent review by the entire community. The Andersons' dream house was finally a home. The gilded cage was gone, its bars melted down by the heat of rightful anger and the formidable power of the law. They had defended their castle, not with a moat and a drawbridge, but with a ramp, a sharp legal mind, and the unshakable courage to fight for what was right. The neighborhood, they realized, wasn't defined by its perfect lawns, but by the strength of its people. And for the first time, Willow Creek Estates was starting to feel like a real community.